Good afternoon. It is Friday, the 7th of January 2022, and I am continuing to read a story I started writing in 2006 and continued to write, finished Book 1 entitled BLISS, Afterlife in 2017, and then have started Book 2, but we are now in Book 1, Chapter 90. New Year's Eve. This is New Year's Eve 2011. So, Holly, how's the book going? They had all enjoyed the fondues. Everybody had helped to prepare the salads. Evelyn had brought some marinated shrimp and her boyfriend Mark had made some bread. They had finished a few bottles of red and Chris had brought a selection of ales. He and David were both great fans of typical English ale, and much was talked at the table about drinking and not drinking and what to drink and what not. David felt totally at home with all of these old friends. He had had many connections in Australia, but he had forgotten how much he had missed this sort of evening. The music in the background was great. He knew Susan would have put a playlist together. Even back in the days she had mixed cassettes, and it was usually she who would encourage them to create new songs and meet up regularly. David had remembered that Holly was always writing in her journal. In fact, they had often joked that they would all end up in one of her novels one day. Susan was saying that even as a child, Holly would write a diary. No one else saw any of it ever. Yes, thanks, David. The greatest composer and artist of this century. Well, the answer is actually, it's still going. Everybody laughed. Chris knew that Holly often said writing, but she had always maintained it was just for herself, and he was usually reading or doing whatever he was doing over the years. Holly never mentioned a book as such, but he knew that Susan had always thought that Holly would become an author when they were younger. Her path into music therapy had evolved over the years. When Chris met her, she was working in an office, but she was very much into music, although the garage days had already been over and everybody seemed to have moved into their lives of work and mortgage and children. They had both owned their own flats, and when they got together, they were suddenly much better off. For the first few years, they had both worked full-time, and by the time Tony was born, Holly could study a bit more and work from home. It seemed that David had wanted to become a musician and composer. A lot of the music they had made was born from David, and also Steve made lyrics up, and then they together recorded it in those days. None of these recordings were around anymore, but they had met over 3 or 4 years very regularly, and the conversation was much about how they all had spent the last 35 plus years. Holly felt that this was one of the best New Year's Eves for years. She always did something with Chris, but in their early years they had gone out with friends, mostly. When Tony was little, they often had a few people around their house, but the last 5 or 6 years they had not done much. In fact, last year they both just stayed at home and watched telly. Chris was in his element with David. They were both well-read and also lovers of jazz, and they were actually both connoisseurs. Holly had wanted to know more about Faye. She was so happy they would stay and the baby would be born here. Conversation had flowed. Well, David, I shall definitely finish the first book this year, my New Year's Eve resolution. Holly held her glass up. She couldn't believe she had said that out loud. Where did that come from? Wow, Holly, that's some statement. Ever since I've known you, you've been writing on something, or are you saying it's like one thing, one book? Everybody had fallen silent, and Chris looked at Holly expectantly. It is, in a way, a story. I call it in my mind. I do journaling as well. You know that, Chris. Yes, this story is something, I believe now. Here, with all of you, talking about how our lives evolved, how our stories played out, until this point, makes me suddenly realize that this is the kind of thing I am writing about. She stopped and breathed deeply. I love my musical life, and I think I made good choices there. There's so much development in the way music and sound affects our brains, affects our consciousness. Dave, remember how you always used to say, consciousness is everything. She had put on a booming voice. Goodness, yes, I remember. We were at your mother's house in the garden. She had invited all of us for an afternoon tea. Best cucumber sandwiches I've ever had. Everybody laughed. She wanted to hear all about our recent song, Steve. And Steve and I had brought out our guitars, and Evelyn had this whole box of percussion, and we sat in her garden singing our songs. We had made up a song which was about consciousness is everything, and Omi thought it was amazing. Remember, everybody called her Omi, as if that was her name. They all laughed. That's true. Susan remembered the afternoon very well, and so did Evelyn, and Holly mentioned how Omi had taken the tambourine. That was such a fun afternoon. All of us stayed over at yours, Susan. You were both still living at home, and your granddad joined us later in the evening. We were stoned. Do you remember? Your Omi was so cool about it all. David got up and picked up a guitar which Tony had left at home. He started to gently play the melody of the song they were talking about. He had forgotten the lyrics. The guitar was very slightly out of tune, but he played on, as it had suddenly all come back to him. Susan, Holly, and Evelyn started humming the tune in harmony as they had done back then. Chris sat back, and Evelyn's friend Mark did the same. So did the neighbours, who had all been fascinated by the whole evening so far. They did not hear the slightly out-of-tune guitar. The melody was beautiful, and Susan started to remember some of the words and started to sing the refrain. Consciousness is everything. Everything evolves. Change is certain. And you play your roles. The others joined in, but that was all they remembered, and they hummed when they had ended the song, and when they had ended the song, they all sat back and looked at each other. How lovely, Mark said. I cannot believe none of you had written it down. You must have felt even back then that this was a beautiful, profound song. How old were you? Oh, no numbers, everyone shouted. Let's just say 20s. Early 20s. Just about 20. At the end of 20, they all laughed. What do you know? What we do know is that Mr. D is the oldest. Evelyn sat mischievously, pointing at David. I was definitely still in my 20s. David remembered celebrating his 29th birthday already in Australia. He was actually not very good remembering which year what happened in general, and was glad about the no-number rule of tonight. Monica, Tim, do you play an instrument? Holly looked at her neighbours, who looked very chilled on the settee. He plays the keyboard rather well, Monica spoke before he had a chance to say anything, and everybody laughed again at his open mouth. She will tell you, he said laughingly. Monica had been complaining about him not playing the keyboard, which was gathering dust upstairs in the spare room. They had had a lot of work done on their house, and Tim could not remember when he had last played numbers again. I have not played at all for a couple of years or so, but yes, I play. And you, Monica, my darling, he teased her, as she had had the intention of learning the ukulele for the last 5 years, ever since they had been to a live concert event with the Yuki Orchestra. but her ukulele was somewhere in the house and had not been touched since he gave it to her 4 years ago. Christmas 5 years ago or so. Okay, no numbers. Anyhow, one day it will just come out and it will come to me and I'll pick it up. Oh, come on. Tim, why don't you go and get your keyboard? We dust it off and have a sing-song. Another hour before the clock strikes 12. Holly stood up. I shall get stuff ready for midnight. Go on, we make some music. She took her sister into her arms and they hugged. Yes, it felt good, and both knew that the new year would be bringing a lot of good stuff. I needed an evening like this. I don't even know how much I did. Susan hugged Holly. I always miss Mum on occasions like this, don't you? Well, yes, now you remind me. She looked up. David was just behind her and sat down to start playing an old tune, singing quietly. You must remember this, a kiss is just a kiss. Before long, everybody had joined in, and when Tim came back with a keyboard, they started to play more of the songs they loved. It seemed easy to think of tunes. Tim would start and all fell in. Evelyn had found Holly's little instrument box with a percussion. She used this in her own work and handed Monica and Mark some wooden sticks to play along. Cecilia. Go on, let's do Cecilia. Everybody knows it. Come on. Holly started to beat the rhythm and they all started singing. Full pelt. Monica and Mark joining in. Everywhere Evelyn grabbed a tambourine. Making love in the afternoon with Cecilia up in my bedroom. So that's the end of chapter 89, and New Year's Eve is continuing. The next part of this chapter is Faye and Ben and friends on New Year's Eve to come. Bye.